okay, I hope you all stretch your legs and got some coffee. We'll continue the conversation. So then I I cut you off a little bit with the technology point that you made, but I think it was actually really interesting how the way that technology and especially specific types of technology that has problems like, oh yeah, generative AI, yeah, it disinforms and it's, steals copyrighted material from people and it's bad for the environment, but it's here to stay, so we
Yeah.
can't really do anything about it. Just like, can
Yeah.
you elaborate, like, why do you think those discourses are so similar?
As I said, a lot of men involved in the in the development. um, it has been sort of like yeah, the we're looking at something that is being generated out of from people and has the problems that we do have in everyday life. So of course there's some sort of spillover from that, the normalization, the sort of like the feeling of, we can't do anything because this is just natural and so on. um, but that's where I'm saying, that we don't have to buy into that. We don't have to say, that this is just something that we have to live with because there's so many good things about it. Because of course there's different kinds of technology, there's different kinds of ways that we can actually control and set some boundaries. And so I think that is, it's going to be a huge problem if we don't say to ourselves that this is not the way it's supposed to be, and it's not normal, and it shouldn't be normalized that we do have these problems that you describe in your book. But it is sort of like it's built in because it is a mirror of the everyday life that we have, which where we still struggle with sexism. We struggle with bias. We struggle with sexual violence against women and girls. So yeah.
And Laura, you, just before we stop, you mentioned like the intersection of white supremacy and the manosphere. And in your new book, you're also detailing the ways that sexism is kind of rife on various digital platforms and how new types of sexism arise with the advent of AI. But I also think like we've had, in the intervening 10 years, we've also had kind of a growing support for moderation and legislation directed at social media, but we're also now seeing that Silicon Valley is kind of leaning into the manosphere and white supremacy. Some Silicon Valley CEOs are like outright supporters or members, like Elon Musk making Grokpedia and promoting far-right white genocide conspiracy theories on X, but also someone like Mark Zuckerberg kind of, removing guardrails for women and minorities and supporting the Trump administration and so on. Um, where do you see us, like, where should we address that and where should we put the pressure? Should we look at alternatives? Is moderation legislation still the way to go? Can you share some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we still have to push for regulation and legislation because realistically, in the long term and on a global scale, that is going to be the only thing that is going to make the really significant difference that we need to see. But I don't think that we are likely to see it happening anytime soon, in part because of that kind of new autocracy where we're seeing this unholy marriage of the power of the presidency and the obscene power and wealth of billionaire tech bros together, which is terrifying. And we are seeing it in real time. We are seeing, for example, Trump releasing his executive act against what he determined as woke in AI, which literally bans tech companies from initiating exactly the kind of common sense guardrails we want to see. If they do, they won't be able to have contracts with the federal government anymore. So we are actively seeing administrations around the world, and particularly in the US, not only failing to act in the way that they should, but actually taking action in the opposite direction to enable this to spread in harmful ways quicker and faster and more effectively. So I guess the question for us then as feminists and as citizens is, okay, we campaign, we push for legislation, we raise our voices collectively, we make demands of our elected representatives. What do we do in the meantime? What do we do while we're waiting for what we hope will be meaningful legislation? And I think for me, there are a number of different answers to that. There is obviously individual action we can take. We can take it in the way in which we educate and support the young people in our lives to understand about what responsible use of these tools look like, to have digital literacy, to have that informed consent and understanding around consent and healthy relationships that is then so relevant to how they use these tools. But there are also, I think, brilliant feminist organizations lobbying and campaigning against some of the explicit harms that these technologies have. And I think that supporting them can be a really powerful thing that we can do as well. So I'm thinking of the Algorithmic Justice League, which takes on AI tools and companies which are having disproportionate impacts, which are amplifying bias, and uses consumer power to try and tackle them. I'm thinking of organizations like Chain and Glitch, which are feminist organizations that specifically support women on the front lines of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and organizations like Equality Now, who are pushing for those global frameworks and guardrails and regulation. There is a lot we can do, and it's so important, I think, at this particular moment that we don't give up. I think people feel really hopeless. I think a combination of the way in which things are moving politically around the world and the scale of the threat from AI and the sense of impunity with which it is operating and developing combine to make it very easy for people to feel overwhelmed and out of their depths and to think, what does it matter anymore? We've already lost. And this is the worst possible moment for us to give up and to step aside. So we have to try and keep that hope and that sense that there is still meaningful work to be done. There is still something to be achieved from collective action if we continue to stand together and fight.
And also, I think it's important that we look at some of the alternatives to the big tech platforms, and we have to look at involving women and exposed minorities in the building up of alternative communities, because there are alternatives to the big to Meta and Google and so on.
Absolutely. I think we're going to take some of the questions from the audience. So please keep writing them, but you're also welcome to raise your hand if you want to ask a question out loud. But one question here is, what are your thoughts on how the conversations about consent, sexual harassment, and everyday sexism, perhaps particularly in Denmark, very often emphasize white victims and targets? We've seen in Denmark that white women on the receiving end of cyberbullying, harassment, sexual assault, etc., receive more attention, more care, more support, and maybe more likely to report and definitely more likely to be taken seriously.
Well, I think that's not a Danish problem. It's a global problem, and I'm sure you agree. I think it's something that has been it's so old, this problem, and I mean it's basically what's been happening for centuries. So what we can do is, of course, stand in solidarity and invite people with with all kinds of minority backgrounds and positions from outside the majority into our conversations, and be very aware that it's not that they're there because we need, the one person, we have to have in this. We're sitting here, we are 3 white women. Of course, we have different backgrounds. We have different, I have Jewish background, for example. I have several handicaps and so on. But the thing is that we shouldn't be doing this thing about being sure of making representatives because we feel like we have to do it. We should do it because, everybody has an insight, a personal insight and a lived experience that we all can benefit from. It's the same thing when we're talking about making the world accessible for people with disabilities, because when we do that, we actually make the world more accessible for a lot of different people, not only people with disabilities. And I think it's very important always to look at it as something that can benefit all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that when we formulate solutions which are beginning with building a solution that works for the most vulnerable in our society, they will automatically be good, robust solutions that work for everybody else. But too often we don't do that. And I think you can really clearly see the consequences of that. In the UK, for example, We know that a fifth of women are disabled. We know that disabled women are twice as likely as non-disabled women to experience domestic violence. But we have a system where fewer than 10% of the refuge spaces available in frontline refuges for those escaping domestic abuse are accessible. So that's a really clear example, I think, of a system that has failed because it was not built with the needs of those women with intersecting identities at its root. And too often it's a bolt-on, it's an add-on, it's a nice to have, it's something we think about afterwards. Okay, and now how can we add in these things? So I think in the same way, actually, that we are really calling on tech companies to take a safety by design approach, to think about these things at design stage, to build them in consciously and intentionally and sustainably, instead of reacting to problems later on through a stress testing process, which relies on the abuse and harassment of marginalized groups as essentially a building block, as raw building materials. In the same way, I think, as the feminist movement, we have a responsibility to recognize an intersectionality by design approach, to be thinking about these things as foundational to the processes of building a campaign, a solution, a demand, rather than things that we kind of add on later.
I think this next question is actually related to it. It's related to the issue of feminationalism. So the question is, how do we navigate when prominent figures in politics who are women, like the Danish Prime Minister, and other figureheads leverage discussions about sexism to target Muslim and brown communities by framing them as sexist or backwards? And I guess that's a problem in the UK as well. Like, you don't care about women's rights unless, the Muslims are doing it, then suddenly you're the biggest advocate.
Yeah, we're seeing actually just now a huge explosion of this problem in the UK, where women's rights are suddenly being weaponized by a group of people who have never been seen at a single, women's rights protest or in support of the frontline services, who suddenly care very deeply about women's rights when they can use them in their anti-immigration rhetoric. There is no evidence to support what they're saying. I think that the evidence and the statistics are one of our strongest weapons in this particular case. In fact, we recently had one of the biggest far-right white supremacist rallies in the UK that we have ever seen. And there was some really powerful data around the number of men present at that rally who were themselves convicted or accused of domestic abuse. There is this enormous irony here that just as in any other kind of form of supremacy, of oppression, of racist and misogynistic movement, what we're seeing is a flipping of the reality. Those who are oppressors are calling themselves oppressed. They are trying to present oppressed groups as the threat, and they are trying to use fear and to weaponize legitimate concerns in the service of racism. I think it's so important as a women's community that we stand up to that we call it out, that we make it very clear that we cannot allow these issues to be co-opted in this way, and to be very clear about the statistics. We have the evidence. We know that this is a huge problem across secular society, across British society. This is not an imported problem, and it's not concentrated within immigrant communities, and we just have to keep being very, very clear about that.
Thank you. Another question, which is on a completely different topic, but back to the digital topic, is the thoughts on the ban of social media for kids under the age of 15. That's a proposal that is coming up in Denmark, but I know you also have legislation in the UK that has discussed the same thing, and you have the Online Safety Act and so on.
Yeah.
But it's not a blanket ban, but it's being discussed in various countries.
Yeah.
Is it going to have any effect on young people or men, as they might but not be as exposed to sexist language and the manosphere, etc.?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, it's very interesting. If we look at Australia, which is the first country to actually do this, what we are seeing in Australia is that big social media companies who have always maintained that it is impossible for them to moderate their platforms in particular ways, suddenly, faced with this ban, are finding magically that there are ways that they can actually make things safer, that they can adjust the algorithm and so on. So I think it's a very useful example. It's a really useful example globally that it is possible for governments to stand up to tech companies. It's a really useful example that capitulation does happen in those circumstances, and that we can use that as inspiration and as evidence. But I also feel that it doesn't necessarily tackle the root cause of the problem. Whenever we focus on preventing children from accessing certain spaces, that can come with that a sense of impunity where adult women are targeted. You know, the ongoing campaigns of disinformation, of extreme misogyny, of harassment and abuse and doxing and misogyny and racism and rape threats and death threats are not suddenly acceptable when they're affecting women of 18 and older. So I think it is important alongside those kinds of campaigns that we continue to push for progressive reform, for systemic changes to moderation policies and to algorithms and so on, that we don't allow it to be used as a kind of loophole, or we'll keep children away from it, so therefore the rest of the toxicity is fine. But I do think that there is a really valid argument to be made about preventing children from having access to what we know essentially to be a mass radicalization tool. We know that that's how it's working.
Yeah, but also I feel like it's like a whack-a-mole. I mean, it's like you're doing it with certain platforms, but like Roblox, for example, where a lot of children are from the age of 6, I think. I mean, this is something that should tell us that you can't just say, you know, okay, you're making these platforms safe for children and not for adults. but it's also like, you know, they'll always find a way. So we have to go to the root of the problem, which is in real life, which is in the developers and in the people in the tech industry and in the capitalist system that actually just wants us to spend a lot of time, and they don't care how we spend it. They don't care the messages that they're sending. They don't care if people are actually getting harmed unless it costs them something, and it should.
Yeah, and I also want to say that in some instances they do care, but they want to control what people are exposed to. So, for instance, recently TikTok was initially banned by an two-party system that agreed, and then it was sold off to Trump allies. And that means that now Larry Ellison, the second richest man in the world and a dedicated Zionist and authoritarian, will now control the medium that most minorities, women, the pro-Palestinian movement, most progressives, Democrats use. So sometimes the bans can also result in government overreach and censorship of these platforms. So, for instance, if you want to make sure that nobody over 15 is on social media, you have to check the identity of everyone on social media. So that's also going to get rid of anonymity, which can again be a problem if you are, for instance, people reporting sexism on an anonymized platform, but you need to be anonymous for it to be a safety. So I think it's also like some of these things are really important, to regulate, but sometimes in the, this very kind of ham-fisted ban regulation, you also risk putting people who need anonymity, for instance, kids, LGBT kids who need to talk to someone who's not their homophobic dad online and so on.
Yeah.
You also risk putting that at risk. So I think it's a really difficult thing to actually do the regulation in a way that doesn't play, the social media platforms that we also do use to reach out and, organize
absolutely.
resistance, that we don't, block ourselves from them. Next question is, how do you view the interplay between psychological, mental disorders and sexism? Do you think it needs to be discussed in relation to sexism, and how?
That's interesting. I don't know whether the person is talking about an implication that people who commit acts of sexism might suffer from psychological disorders, or that experiencing sexism and sexual violence might lead to psychological disorders. I think if it's the former, I would certainly suggest, as we've already said, that I really don't feel that there is evidence to suggest that this is concentrated in any one particular community. We know that there are millions of men committing sexism, sexual harassment, sexual abuse who do not have psychological disorders. And so I would very much focus on patriarchal systems, on male supremacy, on male entitlement as root causes. But I do think there is a really important argument to be made for recognizing the psychological impact of violence on women and girls, not only as it goes alongside acts of physical violence and assault, but also as it is inflicted on those who experience various forms of abuse, both in domestic abuse that isn't physical in nature, coercion, control, and those who experience sustained campaigns of online abuse and the potential psychological impact. I think maybe the biggest recent example of this would be around deepfake nude apps, where we are seeing thousands of women being subjected to a very specific form of abuse, and yet there is an argument that it's not real, so it doesn't matter. There's a double whammy here because it's online, so it doesn't count, which we already know very well as an argument, but now there's the additional argument of, but also the images aren't even real. If it's not an image of your body, then why does it matter? Why would it bother you? And the psychological impact, I think, of experiencing that particular form of abuse, which we know is having a massive impact on women in the public eye, journalists, politicians, but also on everyday women, on school children, the impact on an 11-year-old girl of her male peers being able to download and make a nude fake image of her that looks highly realistic and then share it amongst her peers for their enjoyment, upload it to the internet. The idea that that's harmless when we are seeing girls dropping out of school, developing PTSD, losing their education, is something that we really need to address, I think.
Yeah, and I also think there's a sort of like a parallel between alcohol use and blaming it on mental illness, because it's like when you have a rape case where the perpetrator has been drinking a lot and is very drunk, you use that as an excuse. He was drinking, or he had a mental illness, or he was autistic, and this is not to say anything about, this is just something that I've heard. So he didn't know about boundaries, for example. That is used as an excuse for the perpetrator, but never for the victim. It's used to blame the victim. So if it's a victim having a mental illness, it's like, you shouldn't have been drinking. You shouldn't behave like you do. It's probably because you have a mental illness that you're behaving like that. I had somebody very close to me actually being written in a journal for a psychiatrist that she was engaging in sexual risky behavior when she was raped because of her mental illness. I mean, that was part of it. And it was not because of that. So it's sort of like it works to the benefit of the perpetrator and the opposite for the victim. And I think that's a very big problem, because a lot of this is the usual victim blaming, the usual, you can't take him or her seriously because this person has a mental illness. So probably it's his own fault, or, it's a part of the, maybe schizophrenia or overreacting or reacting, in a very hysterical way because of the mental illness. So it's we should really think about how this is just a way that we amplify the existing myths and conceptions about mental illness, both when we talk about the perpetrator and the victim.
Yes, and stigmatizes entire communities, when so often if we see a white male terror attacker or a white man commit an act of violence,
Yeah.
the immediate narrative is lone wolf, disturbed, what could have gone wrong, he must be mentally ill. And that risks stigmatizing entire communities of people who are themselves much more likely to be at risk of violence than to commit it themselves, whilst, of course, continuing to perpetuate our societal blind spots that a white man couldn't possibly be a terrorist because of a racist blind spot that we have, and that a white male attacker of women couldn't possibly be a terrorist because it's normal for men to attack and murder women.
What is your what's your best advice to include people in this conversation, people that does not feel the same as you or have felt and experienced sexism, so people who don't have personal experiences or have a different viewpoint on these issues?
Well, this is why we're so passionate about education. I think we can't get every adult in the room to listen and to have these conversations, but we can get every child in a classroom to be exposed to different viewpoints and experiences than their own, to think about these issues around how systemic inequality impacts on people's lives, even if they don't directly experience it in a way that they might have thought about before. But I also think this is where we need men. There are so many men asking, I want to be an ally, I want to help. What's my role in this movement? What is the place for me? What is the job for me? This is your job. Bring in those people who we might not be able to reach. Bringing in the people who might not deliberately choose to come to a talk like this, and who might not, because of misconceptions and because of the information that they've come across online about angry feminazis and women being like this, are going to be much more likely to be able to hear and to listen to a fellow man talking to them about this stuff. That there is such a powerful role for men in not just talking to the boys in their lives. And I don't just mean dads, I mean uncles, cousins, big brothers, sports coaches, teachers, community leaders. But I also mean men talking to other men is a really powerful way of bringing them into the movement without them feeling threatened or alienated because of misconceptions that they've heard about feminism being man-hating and so on.
I think it's also, and I think it's also very important to think about ourselves as sort of like we have the rippling effects. So what we try and do is that we try and enlighten people on our social media pages and go out and have workshops and so on, and presentations. And we don't do that because we think that we can turn around somebody who has very misogynistic views, for example, because we can't do that as, you know, an organization, but their peers can do that, their families can do that, the colleagues can do that. And what we often advise people to do who are sitting with a coworker or a family member is to ask curious questions, not roll out the big guns from the beginning, but to ask questions. How do you feel about this? Why are you thinking like this? Who told you this? And of course, it's a very good thing to have facts in your back pocket, but I think it's important that when you talk to people that you know in some way, that you're not being judgmental from the start, but you try and be curious about why they have these views. And sometimes it takes a lot of time to turn people around, but I think empathy is a really good first step, because I think a lot of people, maybe they just don't feel seen. Maybe they just feel like nobody cares about my problems, and so that's a good first way to reach them. And for example, when we go out and we have presentations with school classes and so on, we also talk about how is this gendered way of thinking the world, how is it also harming boys and men? And so, and I do think that there's a bit of like, you know, we are angry feminists and we reserve the right to be angry because there's a lot of things to be angry about. But that doesn't mean that we can't feel compassion also, and empathy. And we use the Man Box survey, for example, to say that these men that are very much likely to commit violence against women, they're also very much likely to have thoughts about suicide. They're also very likely to engage in risky behavior. So these are some of the signs. If you see somebody you know who are binge drinking all the time and lashing out and so on, it means that they, of course, have a problem, and that you should be, in some ways, empathetic and try to find out why is that. Is it because you miss some kind of community, and can we create that as an alternative to all the manosphere that they're probably actually sitting and watching and feeling that that's their community. Yeah.
How do we, women in particular, regain trust in authorities such as police and doctors? My question is based on the countless stories from women's perspective or health issues have been denied, neglected, or straight out ignored.
Yeah, we just had a campaign on our social media page about that, that the health system, there's a lot of surveys and evidence that women's pain is treated as not as, it's sort of like normalized and not treated in the same way as pain when men present with pain. So what we see is that this is just one of the many ways that we have gendered expectations and how they play out. And fortunately, in Denmark, we've had a lot of attention around this topic. So I'm kind of optimistic that we'll see some bettering in the future. Also because there's going to be a lot more research into it. But yeah, I'm like it's. There's so many things that we could dive into, and I think it's all the crux of the matter. I think is that, as we can see in the bottom of the pyramid, that we have to enlighten people about these things, because that's the first step. It's to acknowledge that there is a problem, and explain what is the problem, and take it from there.
I think actually this reminds me a little bit of another thought I had about the question you asked just before the break. Where do we go next? What is the difference between what's happened over the last 10 years and where we go in the next 10 years? For me, we've had the most incredible decade of survivors courageously changing the national and international conversation. We are in a completely different place now from where we were in 2012 or 2014. And it is because millions of women around the world have so bravely spoken out collectively about their experiences, partly through Everyday Sexism, partly through Me Too and other movements like them. What we haven't seen, and what I think needs to be the focus of the next 10 years, is systemic reform to acknowledge what those women have said. We've seen the conversation change. People are aware it's much more difficult for people to dismiss the idea that sexism exists. Survivors feel more able to tell their stories. But what we haven't seen is a corresponding institutional revolution in the way in which complaints are dealt with by the criminal justice system, the way in which women are dealt with when they go to the doctor or when they find themselves in hospital, the way in which women are treated in the workplace. And what that means is that we are now at this kind of strange tipping point where we're aware, we know the problem exists, but we're still coming up against it. And I think for me, the answer to this question of how we rebuild our trust in those institutions and individuals within those institutions has to be systemic reform. We can't just tell women, just come forward and just, be brave, when we know that there remains institutional racism and misogyny in policing, in criminal justice, in healthcare, in education. The only way to rebuild women's trust in those organizations and institutions is to see actual, real root and branch reform of those systems. We need to see changes to police vetting procedures. We need to see changes to the way that court trials are held, for example, training jurors in rape myths. We need to see changes that enable women to have a sense of confidence and safety that if they come forward, they will be heard, they will be treated with respect, they will be believed. And this comes back again, I think, to the conversation about intersectionality, because we have to recognize that women of color, disabled women, women in prostitution, women who are particularly migrant women, women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, these are all women who have experienced double and triple forms of discrimination from these institutions, the least likely to be believed, to be supported, to be taken seriously. So that systemic reform has to be intersectional in nature in order to improve all women's confidence. It's such a focus on women being the problem, right? It drives me mad that we see these headlines, has Me Too really changed anything? And you think, yes, it has changed everything in our public attitudes and perception of the problem, but no, it hasn't yet changed the systemic barriers, and that is not a failing on the part of that movement or those courageous survivors. It's a failing on the part of those political gatekeepers and people in positions of power who have failed to hear and to act. They've paid lip service often. They've had photo ops, but they haven't made the foundational changes that we need to see. And portraying that as a failing on the part of survivors, in the same way, I think, as blaming those women who don't come forward for the fact that they then don't receive support, is incredibly frustrating. We have to see systemic reform.
Yeah, and also when you mentioned that, the headlines, I saw, was it yesterday or the day before, that the Times had a headline saying, is women the problem in the workplace?
Yeah.
Question mark.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, that depends on how you what problem are we talking about? Because we very often we get phone calls from it can be universities, it can be other sort of like soccer association, it can be culture association, it can be a workplace. And they call us and they say, I have this problem at work. And we're like, okay, so do you have any systems in place that tells your employer how to act if something like this happens? And very often the answer is no. So everybody's got this like, what to do if there's a fire. And there's not very often a fire, but there's very often sexual harassment in the workplace. So it's actually, I mean, we've come a long way, and we do have a lot of laws and regulations in place, but it seems like we still have so many people falling through the cracks, because there are a lot of places that still miss this kind of like conversations about what do we do, and do not take them when the accident has happened. I mean, that's a big problem, because they're like, suddenly they're like, oh, because we get calls from people who are experiencing sexualized harassment, but we also get from the leaders. And maybe it's a very small place, and it's like role playing or scouts or whatever. And they're like, what should we do? What should we do? And we're like, well, it's a bit late now. So we always tell them, and please do write down what to do before the next thing happens, because it will. So so of course there's a lot of work to do in the judiciary system, for example. I think we've been coming a long way actually in Denmark. That was one of the things that we said back in 2018, and now there are specialized police teams that deal with gendered violence. Not big enough, and they don't go out broad enough, but it's still an improvement, and they get a lot of education in the police force. So we have come a long way, but there's a lot of structures and systems that don't have this education, that don't have the conversations around what to do in case of a fire. So yeah.
I want to ask you something as well. We discussed like how feminism can be weaponized, to vilify Muslim and brown communities, for instance. What do you think? How should we deal with kind of the vilification of trans women under the banner of feminism? This is also a place where we're seeing, oh, we're doing something systemic now to protect women. We're defining them as a biological women in the UK, for instance. Which means that basically trans women can't have their gender recognized, or you can legally discriminate them, leave them out of women's shelters and so on. We're also seeing it at home here in Denmark, where again people who are not normally feminists suddenly they want to protect women's spaces, whereas like, well, it's actually like not these women we need protection from, it's something else. But it seems like you can on one hand pretend you're doing something as a politician, you can kind of throw a group of women under the bus. How do we deal with this as a feminist community, do you feel?
I mean, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? It's so heartbreaking, because you are seeing people who purport to be on the same side, who should be focused on trying to ensure access to safety and support for the greatest possible number of vulnerable people. And instead, suddenly there is this schism and this weaponization of one vulnerable community against another. I mean, I have looked through the 250,000 testimonies that we've received at Everyday Sexism, specifically to look at this issue, and it could not be clearer that of those 250,000 testimonies, there are a handful where it is stated that the person who had perpetrated the harassment or the violence was a trans woman. And there are so many more from trans women themselves subjected to violence, to harassment, to abuse at the hands of male perpetrators, suffering from the same male violence, the same rigid gender roles and stereotypes that we are fighting against. How we can exclude those women from our movement when they are experiencing the exact same problems that we are fighting against, but also when demonstrably they are not the threat. We are talking about male violence. That is where the critical threat is. That is where the focus should be. I feel very strongly that this is something that has been weaponized on social media by bad actors. There is evidence to suggest interference and funding from Russia, from the far right, from particularly evangelical Christian groups. It's being used as an issue to try and tear feminism apart, to destroy us. And it's incredibly frustrating to see when that succeeds, because there is every reason for us to be on the same side, of course, to include trans women in this movement, which is so much about fighting against exactly the problems they are so vulnerable to.
It's a question of solidarity. I mean, it's like in every case where you see people in power trying to regain or trying to hold on to that power, that they try to divide us. So I think it's what we have to do is the same as we do when they do that. Be solidaric. So yeah.
Final question. Someone looking for advice. I want to make feminist content to help other women, but I'm so scared of people making deep fakes of me or receiving rape or death threats, but I think it's the only way forward for women in feminism. Help and thoughts on what to do.
It makes me so angry that you have to ask that question. I'm so sorry. I hate the idea that we're living in a world where this is a barrier, that any woman who wants to make a difference has to make this impossible choice. What I would say is that there's no right or wrong decision for you to make. It's incredible that you want to create this change, and any way that you choose to fight this cause is wonderful. If it means that you choose to be anonymous but to create this content and not to put your own face on it, that's brilliant. That's absolutely fine. If you do choose to put your face out there and you then experience these forms of abuse, that does not make it your fault. You have done nothing wrong. There is brilliant help and support available. And if you're at this stage of thinking about starting an initiative, there are really, really great guides to how to do it safely in terms of putting in place digital security before you begin. You can email me at laura@everydaysexism.com and I can send you a whole bunch of these guidelines. But you can also find them from organizations like Glitch, Chain, Feminist Frequency had a really, really good thing about finding any kind of potential weak spots and making sure that you're blocking them off before you begin. And what I would say is you are not alone, and I promise you that we will keep fighting to try and stop this stuff from happening in the first place, so that you don't have to make this ridiculous and impossible decision, and that we will support you and be there for you, whatever you decide and whatever happens.
I think that is why in Everyday Sexism, what I will, my advice would be, find something to do, find someone to do it with, because it's very important to have a support system. And I think that we are so many, luckily, that you will find a support system. And then I think you should probably reach out and hear someone that, if somebody's willing to do it together, because, that's what we do. We get these shitstorms and we get harassed and stuff happens and it's really tough. But the good thing is that we also have a lot of people, and you will experience a lot of people messaging you saying you're making a difference. That's what gets me going after that many years. It's because people message us and say, you're making such a difference and you've made a difference in my life, and thank you for making this content. So yeah.
And with those words, thank you very much for coming. And thank you to these amazing women.
Yeah.